Yeah, well, of course the river system really started, goes back to the 1830s really, when they pioneered these rivers and started using the river boats up to Casino. Irvington Wharf was the main loading point in Casino. One of the interesting things that happened in those early years, 1847, there was a massive flood and the steamer Irvington steamed up to the bottom of what's now Barker Street. I don't think there has been a flood of that magnitude since, maybe in the 50s, in the 1950s, but for a riverboat to actually steam up to basically the shopping centre in Barker Street, quite a thing. But I suppose that reflects one of the reasons for the change in the transport was the erosion of the rivers, and also the silting up that occurred as a result of the clearing of the big scrub, which was all round Casino in those days. And it cost increasingly huge amounts of money to keep the river clear for the riverboats, hauling logs and things like that out, and I presume doing minor dredging works. Of course, there was also bullock teams that worked out of those areas, and in that era too, that Larry O'Keefe ran a horse-drawn coach in the late 19th century that went across to Tenterfield over the mountains, which anyone who drives over the Malangani Range today on the tiny little bit of highway knows what an incredible climb it is, even for a car or a truck, and to contemplate going up over that mountain range in a horse-drawn coach, like a Cobb and Co type coach. But that's what he did, and it used to take nearly a week to get from Casino to Tenterfield by coach. Of course, the starting point for the coach became Old Casino Station. But another thing which, of course, around that era was the influence of the squatter Ogilvy, who was the first man into the Clarence area. Ogilvy came up and seized 50 miles of the Clarence River and said, "This is mine," and set up a massive kingdom complete with a Moorish style castle which still exists out at Barrugal. He was a hugely influential man. He managed to get government money to build roads. When the railway surveyors came up, he managed to divert them, and they spent a couple of years surveying basically impossible railways to serve his pastoral interests. And of course, so consequently, the roads, etc., that would have normally been looked at in those eras, to connect to Sydney and things like that, the program was hijacked for a while by the squatters. By the end of the 19th century, the riverboats were becoming harder and harder to operate, and it was around that time, of course, that the first line was, the construction of that started between Mullumbimby and Lismore. But it was to be part of a greater scheme. It was actually going to be the Sydney to Brisbane line via Tenterfield, Casino, Murwillumbah, Tweed Heads and on to Brisbane. Of course, an interesting thing was that the Queensland and New South Wales governments did a deal that the Queensland was to build their line to Tweed Heads to main line standards, and they spent millions of pounds putting heavy bridges and wider tunnels onto the Brisbane to Tweed Heads line, and the agreement was New South Wales was going to meet them and they were going to put dual gauge in, and that never happened. But the transcripts of what was said in the parliaments in Queensland and the disappointment of the Queensland Transport Minister at the time is well on the public record. Even the railway equipment was unloaded because it was an isolated railway line. There was no through connection to Sydney really until mid-1920s on that section, and so locomotives and the carriages had to be brought up by ship, and they were unloaded at Lismore. So there was quite an overlap of river and rail, but of course the shipping continued to come up the river to Lismore until probably the 1920s or even later, when the era of the coastal ship went into decline, and so the rail and the road overlapped for many years, but the river trade up from Lismore to Casino basically ceased with the a few years after the railway line opened, because of the problems of the siltation of the Richmond River. So you know, Casino has a very rich history of road, rail, and river, and fits into that quite well.